Hi, I'm Jeff Tucker, Director of Content at Idaho Public Television. I want to welcome you to this virtual event surrounding Resilient Idaho, Hope Lives Here, and I want to thank Optum Idaho for helping to organize this event. In October of 2019, in conjunction with a large group of very interested parties, Idaho PTV produced a Q&A panel on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, called Resilient Idaho, Hope After Trauma. It was during that time that we became connected to a few brilliant and determined people. One such person was Jean Mucci with St. Luke's Community Health Services. Jean is part of the Culture of Health Leaders program funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. At one point she said to me, "You're going to make a documentary on this subject and I'm going to help you." I could tell this was a "I dare you to make it happen" statement. We like those kind of nudges here at Idaho PTV, especially when it's a topic that everyone should know about. It fit perfectly with our mission of educating and connecting all Idahoans. Participants of the Idaho Resilience Project helped us find the people who told their amazing stories you'll hear today. One consistent theme is the resilience and hope they possess can help conquer adversity. Funding for the documentary has been made possible by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Optum Idaho, and we thank them for their generosity. Although this will not be the end of our work in the field of ACEs, the project marks a great effort by dozens of participants to show the people of Idaho are strong and resilient. We hope you benefit from watching this documentary. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening and welcome to Resilience, Hope Lives Here, three-part professional series. We're so glad you could join us tonight. My name is Nicole Sanchez, and I had the privilege of working on this important documentary on adverse childhood experiences, also called ACEs for short. We also focused heavily on resilience, something that was very important to us. We wanted to make sure this story showed positive examples of people who were able to bounce forward after trauma, something I think we can all learn from. A couple of housekeeping items. If you're not talking, please make sure your mic is muted. Once the video starts, we'd like everyone to turn off their mic and camera so it's easier to focus on the documentary. And tonight, we are so excited that by attending the event series, you'll be eligible for professional development credit. Carrie Wardle is the education manager at Idaho Public Television and is with us to share a little more about the credit options. Carrie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to take a minute tonight. So as Nicole said, I'm the education manager here. I'm actually handling the professional development credit for educators. And so I'll just give you a brief rundown, and then please just know that all of this information will come to you again in an email after the session is over. If you want to receive, if you're an educator and you want to receive a professional development credit for this series of webinars, you can do that we're offering a professional development credit through Idaho State University. So you will need to register through ISU. Again, I'll send all of the links out in a follow-up email after this.
And that is great.
And then you must you must attend all three of the sessions. So for professional development credit, you have to do 15 hours. So you must attend all three of the sessions, which are being recorded for you to watch later should you need to do that. And then there's also a little bit of additional work that would need to be done outside of the webinars just to meet that 15-hour requirement.
Right.
I will send that link to everybody. We do ask if you are not talking that you mute your microphone. Please. Oh, I'm so sorry, you guys. There's a ding because I'm a co-host of the show, and so when people come in, it's dinging. So I will send you the information to register through ISU, and that registration will be open until October 31st. So you could join it, at kind of any point, because we are also recording this for you to watch later. And recordings will be sent out, links will be sent out afterwards. And I'm going to use Google Classroom as the way to, as the management system. I will tell you again all of this, but just wanted you to know that it's available. It's available through Idaho State University, professional development credit, and we'll follow up with an email. When you registered, you were asked if you were interested in credit information. And so I have that information and we'll send a follow-up email. Roger Sherman from the Idaho Children's Trust Fund is going to talk about CEUs for anybody who might not be an educator, social workers, counselors, people like that. So Roger, you can talk about that.
Hi all, I am the director of the Idaho Children's Trust Fund, which is the state affiliate of Prevent Child Abuse America, and we've been involved in this documentary and really excited that all of you are here. Boise State University, through the School of Social Work, will provide CEUs for the contact hours, meaning the time that you participate in this webinar today. And if you participate in the webinar in September, you can get up to 4 hours of CEUs through this. We are recording who is in attendance, and so those people who have registered as social workers, counselors, or other non-educator professionals can get CEU hours based on the based on having attended. So we will keep track of that, and then BSU will send certificates to those people based on the hours that you have attended. So it is a little simpler for counselors and social workers.
Thanks so much, Roger and Carrie. Tonight, we have two special guests with us who will be presenting on a very important topic. They'll be talking about self-care for professionals dealing with traumatic stress. Dr. Julie Wood is the Behavioral Medical Director for Optum Idaho. Dr. Wood, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Nicole, thank you. And thank you everybody for allowing me to be part of this evening's event. I'm very excited about it. I have had the opportunity to review or to view this documentary, and I think it is so well done. It really highlights a lot of important information about the severity of child abuse and the potential outcome, but I also really love how it's focused on the resilience and showing people that have overcome some of those obstacles and gone on to live a really healthy, productive life. So I'm excited for tonight. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. We also have Dr. Dennis Woody. He is the Senior Clinical Program Consultant, also at Optum Idaho. Dr. Woody, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Nicole. I am just thrilled to be part of what I see around Idaho as a growing awareness of just how much capacity we have for hope, and as a consequence of that hope, the resilience that we need to kind of create things for Idahoans that really work here for us. And I think our voices together, learning what other folks have done, can collaboratively come up with something that is unique and very effective. So thank you.
And now it's time to watch Resilience, Hope Lives Here, a project that took more than a year to produce during a worldwide pandemic. We interviewed 45 people and traveled to many different parts of the state to learn more about how people can be resilient. Please stay with us after the video for the special presentation by Dr. Wood and Dr. Woody on self-care for professionals dealing with traumatic stress. We will also have some Q&A time with them. So if you have any questions, feel free to send those in through the chat feature. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be happy to take those questions after the program and presentation. So everyone turn off your cameras, make sure your mic is muted, and let's start the film. It's time now for our workshop by Dr. Wood and Dr. Woody, both from Optum Idaho. They'll be talking about self-care for professionals. But first, a quick tip for you. You can adjust the view by going to the upper right corner of your screen. Choose side-by-side speaker option. The doctors will be sharing information, so that view will allow you to see both of them talking and also see their presentation at the same time. And just a reminder, you can send in questions. I'll answer right after the workshop. Just go to the bottom of your screen, use the chat feature. So please let us know if there's any questions the doctors can answer for you. Dr. Wood and Dr. Woody, please take it away.
Thank you, Nicole. And let me just share my screen here. Well, again, I want to thank IPTV team for organizing this event, and thanks to all the participants actually for sharing your evening with us. I think that I can speak honestly for both Dr. Woody and myself that we're delighted to be here and share this information with you. You know, whether you've seen this documentary once just tonight for the first time or several times, you still can take something away from it. I've seen it quite a few times and I've learned something new each time, honestly. But as professionals and the nature of our business and working closely with individuals, I think we're all impacted to some degree by ACEs, and we may not recognize it or be fully appreciative of how it affects us. So tonight we're hoping to bring that forward and teach you a little bit more about the secondary traumatic stress as it affects professionals. And, you know, we want to share our goals, and just hopefully by the end of the session, you'll be much more familiar with the direct effects of trauma on those that are victimized, but also the secondary effects of trauma on professionals. We hope to enlighten you about ways to identify it, ways to mitigate it through tonight's activities. So, you know, the stats around child abuse are quite staggering. We hear them, we see them, we heard the numbers in this documentary. We also want to reiterate from the documentary that those with more ACEs are at greater risk for developing negative health behaviors, developing chronic health problems, and even shortened lifespan. And so, you know, SAMHSA also points out that there's a high risk of developmental problems as well. And so this generally negative impact creates an environment and makes it difficult for children that have had high ACEs, makes it difficult for them to learn the necessary skills to face and tackle complex problems. It also creates problems associated with behavioral outbursts, with socialization, with self-esteem. And so, as mentioned previously, again, just really pointing out, and I think the number in the documentary, that it can reduce somebody's lifespan by 20 years. That's pretty significant. And so now I would like to let Dr. Woody talk about just the effects of trauma and what we see when kids actually experience abuse.
Thanks, Dr. Wood. I think as we have appreciated the poignancy of the video that we've watched and the stories behind them, we've heard a variety of terms used. And so, at least in my portion of the presentation, what I would like to do is kind of delineate across these different terms the specifics and how it makes a difference. The other thing that I hope to be able to convey is the notion that stress and trauma in general are parts of our living experience. And the more successful we are, the more resilient we can be, the better off we are. So let me start with the notion of this trifecta of issues: neglect, stress, and trauma. And neglect, you heard in the video, is basically the failure to meet a person's physical or emotional needs and social needs. And depending upon when that occurrence takes place, can have devastating impacts. When you look at stress, there's no way to avoid it in our lives. We have stress. And the reality is, it's our caregivers from the very outset of our lives who help us learn to manage it. That's called basically positive stress. When a child is stressed with uncertainty, they turn and retreat to their parent or their guardian, and the guardian consoles them. Or if they fall down and injure themselves, they retreat to their parent or guardian. And that sort of consolation, that sort of wrapping your arms around the child, diminishes the actual neurological events that have occurred. And under those circumstances, learning takes place, and an acceptance of that positive sort of stress enables the organism itself and the environment to continue to probe and learn and challenge. There's another kind of stress called tolerable stress, and it occurs for shorter periods of time and may be overwhelming. It occurs typically and allows the brain an attempt to recover and reverse any of the harmful effects that sustained exposure has resulted in. It is capable of changing some of the brain architecture, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that at a relatively high level. And that architecture that is so essential, especially in the developing toddler's brain and young child. When that architecture is significantly altered, it actually changes the trajectory of that child's development in a significant way. And then finally, there's the third type of stress that you've heard referred to several times this evening, and it's called toxic stress. And it is the persistent, unhealthy amount of stress caused by chronically stressful conditions without the protective benefits of healthy caregiving. And you can imagine all kinds of different scenarios that result in toxic stress. And that's the one that we refer to so much in the context of adverse childhood experiences. And then finally, the last of these conditions is trauma. Trauma is any stressor that exceeds a person's resources for managing how they cope with it. And the responses in the human beings to trauma can be highly variable, and in very positive sense can be somewhat insulated for. Let's go to the next slide, Dr. Wood. Other basic assertions about these concepts that we're talking about involve ideas for recovery. Support works in assisting a person learn to deal with it or manage a traumatic experience or situation. And so in some sense, hope springs eternal. And you heard this referred to in the video, that it only took one person with a sustained effort to demonstrate for a child that they had confidence in them to see them through the process and at least instill that hope. So learning about resiliency can lead to effective recovery from traumatic experiences, very traumatic experiences. Next slide. So what I hope to be able to do is talk about some of the anatomy and development of brain structures and why are they relevant and how is it that they impact what we're talking about this evening. There are many negative effects of childhood abuse and neglect on how the brain does develop. And some of these effects typically result in decreased sizes of various brain structures, for example, the corpus callosum. And that's the part of the brain that communicates between each of the two hemispheres. And when the hemispheres aren't effective in their way of communicating with one another, you have a very disjointed development of child's skill sets. And that includes both sensory and motor and emotional. You also have a decreased size of what's called the hippocampus. And that structure is essential for learning and memory because it's where our memories are initiated. And from there, memory is dispersed throughout the brain. And if it's not done in an effective way, it makes it very difficult to use it on a daily basis. You also see less volume in what are called the prefrontal cortex. And that area of the brain regulates emotions and behaviors. And you can imagine that if those structures don't work well, then the person's capacity to modulate their behavior becomes compromised to a significant degree. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. Though it's relatively small, the brainstem is an extremely important part of your brain, as the nerve connections for both motor and sensory functions pass through it, going up into the cortical areas and down into some of the peripheral areas of your body. So it's a pathway that is essential to be intact. It also plays an important role in the regulation of your cardiac system, respiratory, your breathing, issues related to autonomic functions. And when you think about those things, your heart rate and your breathing rate, those are the things that actually kind of get out of whack when you are extremely stressed. And if that system isn't functioning well, it's hard to regulate those issues. And in the brainstem, you have different structures, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but you have the pons, and it has areas that relay signals to the front of your brain, to the cerebellum that's in the back of your brain, which is a relatively large system. The coordination of that relates to behavior in a way that translates from emotional to motor functions. The midbrain is associated with your vision, your hearing, your motor control, your sleep and your wake cycles, your alertness, and even your temperature regulation. So within that midbrain, the integrity of that function becomes essential. And finally, there's the medulla, which is the lower half of the brainstem, and it contains, again, cardiac and respiratory functions and centers that regulate other autonomic systems. That essentially develops, before this next component. And if you'll go to the next slide, Dr. Wood, we're looking at the limbic system. That is a set of structures in the brain that deals with emotions and memory. It regulates your endocrine and your autonomic system in response to what you interpret as emotional stimuli. It's also involved in reinforcing behavior. So this system becomes really essential when the consideration for interpreting environmental cues and then regulating your behavioral response. If you compromise a system this complex, then you compromise a person's capacity to respond appropriately under circumstances that are needed. So past research on emotion has led to models which affective cues are processed through two complementary systems. One is in the front and one is in the back. And the coordination of these two systems becomes the choreography that we need when it's required for us to effectively work well within an environment that might be stressful. Okay, next slide. Now, if I've talked about the structures, let's talk about the function and essentially the fuel. And we're basically talking about hormones. And if you think about that first one there, cortisol, it's really nature's built-in alarm systems for our brain. It's the main stress hormone that you use. And it controls mood, motivation, and fear. And it's regulated or developed, cortisol is developed through your adrenal glands that kind of sit on the top of your kidneys. Cortisol also plays an important role in a number of things that your body does. It keeps inflammation responses down. It regulates your blood pressure. It increases your blood sugar, glucose, and it controls your sleep-wake cycle. Now, together with the next two hormones that you see listed there, adrenaline and noradrenaline, these increase your heart rate and your blood pumping from the heart. It also increases your blood pressure and helps you break down fat and increase blood sugars, all in response to stress. And the final one there, the corticotropin releasing factor is, and this is a fancy term, a neuropeptide. It's a major regulator of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system. That system is responsible for regulating our overall effectiveness under stress. So I go through those systems in an attempt to help you appreciate the complexity of this interaction is astonishing. And it occurs over a period of time that is critical, particularly in infancy, toddlers, and early childhood, where we learn to regulate some of these almost in a voluntary way at times. And stress is related to the capacity to monitor those systems. Next slide. Throughout the development, during our lifespan, the brain's sensitivity to the environment remains very relevant to healthy growth and the ability to increase all kinds of skills, such as socializing, communicating, and successfully engaging in our world. This process is dependent upon experience, and those experiences ideally would be positive and nurturing so that we can expand our skill sets, improving our capacity to be successful in our relationships with other people and with the challenges that we encounter in our lives. Next slide. When the experiences translate to stressful situations and chronic exposure, we are at risk for toxic levels of stress that can change not only our emotional and psychological health, but also alters our capacity for healthy brain growth. And what you heard, not only in the video, but what you're hearing from me is that change can be very destructive to our capacity to develop a broad spectrum of healthy responses. And as a consequence, we struggle with everything from emotional to physical, medical problems. Next slide. The sensitive systems that are still developing are typically negatively impacted by dysregulated or toxic levels of stress. And this is generally created by elevated brain hormones. And so helping a person who might be in that situation learn how to mitigate that status becomes really critical for us as professionals as we attend to them, supporting them with our skills about interventions and therapies. Next slide. The cell death that occurs is typically the result of a sodium cascade that compromises the integrity of the cell membrane and changes that specific region's of the brain's ability to process information and to continue to grow appropriately. And this type of interruption can translate to physical changes, wherein the brain is actually smaller and less well able to function. And some rather fascinating research was initiated in the late 90s into the 2000s that clearly demonstrated that the brain size of children and young adults was actually reduced for those people who had histories of toxic stress. Next slide. So many factors influence individual reactions to stressful events that even children in the same family who share similar traumatic backgrounds can have different responses. One child in a family might develop an intense drive for academic achievement, and another may engage in behavior that makes concentration nearly impossible for that child and other students in the classroom. And that tends to be a spiraling effect downward in terms of the child's ultimate success. So you heard a variety of professionals in the video say that, it's really important for us to begin to look at this situation more as an issue of what has happened to this child's developing brain or this person's brain over a lifetime that would result in the circumstances that I'm dealing with right now with them. Next slide. Interesting research about toxic stress and developing children's responses to it has yielded some information about characteristic patterns of behavior. And what generally is noted is that some children, young adults, respond with hyperarousal, while On the other side of the issue, the same circumstances translate to what's referred to as dissociative events for other children. This is kind of fascinating in the context of neither of these circumstances translates to success in an environment over time. Next slide. Although the elements of hyperarousal are described in this particular slide for infants and toddlers, the effects can also be evidenced in the patterned responses of adults. It is simply the body's method for preparing a person to move away from a stressful circumstance. Even when perhaps the situation may not warrant it, it ends up being the same response for all stressors with very limited variation in the person's pattern for behavior. So in other words, they tend to react in the same fashion to whatever the stimulus is that threatens them. Next slide. Now, in the context of a dissociative response, it can seem inappropriate to the situation to the extent that the person doesn't physically flee from the circumstance and instead may seem to be resigned to it and basically detached from the reality of the environment. This is basically the hide posturing that is often seen in younger children when they're overwhelmed over time with stress, but again, can translate into adult patterns of behavior. Next slide. Now, persistent exposure to toxic levels of stress and trauma can result in a broad spectrum of attributes and behavior and struggles with interpersonal characteristics. Now, the elements listed here from research done in 2008 are but a sampling of the situations confronted by persons with high stress and chronic trauma exposure. When challenged with a situation, it is not difficult to understand that a person becomes overwhelmed and is in need of professional support to learn how to mitigate this problem. We as professionals spend our working days attempting to provide support. And now Dr. Wood is about to share with us the notion that we too might be impacted in ways that are important to understand. Dr. Wood?
So this brings us to kind of how this affects you as a professional. And I want to thank Dr. Woody for providing the insight into the direct effects of trauma. And now we're going to kind of switch gears and focus on those indirect effects and how they affect professionals and lead to what we call secondary traumatic stress. First, I want to start though with this concept of compassion satisfaction, compassion fatigue, and there's a model that will kind of evolve as we continue to talk, but starting with some definitions. You know, we all go into our respective professions just really gung-ho, we're energized, we're excited, we're positive, we're going to make a big difference. And, you know, that can last for some time, but as time goes on and we're confronted with more responsibilities, maybe responsibilities that we don't feel that we're adequately prepared for or that we have the support of, you know, our satisfaction tends to wane and it kind of heads toward fatigue where we're a little bit tired, we're a little bit frustrated. And it can also lead to burnout. And this isn't a unidirectional 1, 2, 3 and you're done. The good thing is that we can find ways to decrease that fatigue, decrease that burnout, and those are through the resiliency and ways of identifying, you know, what our triggers are for that stress. And so I just want to point out that, you know, you can get back to a satisfaction state of mind, really. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here, though, and talk about traumatic stress. And we've all heard of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And we know that individuals that have experienced a trauma, such as ACEs, are at high risk for that. But what we don't hear about so much is secondary traumatic stress. And that is the exposure that we as professionals that work closely with individuals that have been traumatized and we hear their stories and we see the outcomes of that, it really can start to affect us and erode kind of our mental and physical health as well. And so that term secondary traumatic stress is something that we really want to focus on here. And so, you know, we've talked about ways and implemented ways to help first responders for years deal with secondary traumatic stress. And then as that evolved, we started to see that healthcare workers were also affected by it. But more recently, again, just in the last few years, really, they've started kind of looking at secondary traumatic stress on teachers and professionals that are not directly related to healthcare. And so there was an article by the National Education Association today. I didn't know it had a name, and that focused on that secondary traumatic stress with educators. And in addition to kind of defining it and talking about that article also, you know, it didn't only put responsibility on the educators themselves to be aware and to fix it per se, but it also put responsibility on the administration, the institutions, to recognize that it's a true problem and we have to do something about it. And there needs to be a supportive environment or culture where when we feel unsafe as a professional, you know, we've got the support of the administration, and it goes back and forth. You know, this model of kind of parallel process started back in the late 80s by Dr. Sandy Bloom. She was an inpatient physician at a small unit. And over time, she started to notice that individuals that work closely together, especially with traumatized individuals, started to develop similar behaviors and actions and thoughts. And so her sanctuary model around trauma-informed care developed this parallel process. And she talked about, you know, 4 pillars, but more recently a group in Oregon, that a group of clinicians, I should say, in Oregon put together this 3-pillar process. And when you look at this, you know, even though it was initially talked about by clinicians, I think we can easily adapt it for education, educators and teachers, administrative educators, excuse me. And what we are looking at here is this, you know, this left to right kind of continuum of, say you have a student or a client that feels angry, is aggressive, you can start to become angry and aggressive as the educator, as the clinician. But then what happens is administration there can be punitive behaviors. And so really each section or each pillar starts to have those same kind of behaviors and thoughts. You know, not only does this go left to right, I think that we can also read it from right to left, whereas you're in an institution or in a group where there's really not much sense of mission. What are we going to do? How are we looking at things? And the educator, the clinician, the employees start to feel hopeless. Well, that hopelessness then can be projected onto their clients and their students. And so we look at this both right and left to right, but then, you know, and also in reality, it can be bidirectional. So if you have an educator, a clinician that something's going on and they are feeling unsafe, they're feeling kind of hyper aroused, then that projection can go again both toward the administration and the student, and it really just creates an unsafe environment. So learning how to kind of mitigate that and bring in some safety measures, bring in support, starting to recognize that, you know, this truly exists, I think is where we need to focus. We do know that there are a number of risk factors for secondary trauma. I think you can see largely that, you know, some of them are modifiable, others are not. You don't have any control over them, but where you can modify those, then, you can take these different types of risk factors and some of them turn them into more protective factors. We talked about resiliency a lot, and that's a buzzword that's used really in every avenue today, but resiliency is not genetic. It's not something we were born with. It's something that we can learn. And by understanding your risk factors, then you can start to address some of the protective factors and focus on how can I change some negative coping skills to more positive coping skills? How can I build my resiliency? How can I help my organization put together a safer place to work? And so really, you may be thinking about all this information on a broad level or even more of a very personal level. And you're kind of asking yourself these questions, you know, when I'm exposed, or how much can I take, or what will happen? Unfortunately, we're not born with these built-in barometers that kind of help us understand this and understand what is going to happen or when it's going to happen. But there are ways, luckily, that we can start to become aware. We can start to understand what our triggers are, what symptoms or feelings we have when we're in the throes of stressful events. And so with that, you know, luckily there's been a lot of research and some tools that have been put together to help you as professionals understand and learn to identify. And so, you know, this going back to that compassion, satisfaction, and compassion fatigue model, I told you it was going to come back around, but, you know, we look at the compassion, satisfaction, and we look at that as all the quote unquote good stuff, the things that energize us, that make us feel better, that make us want to go in and learn a new form of therapy or create, you know, new educational techniques for our opportunities for our students. The flip side, that compassion fatigue, you know, the quote unquote bad stuff, is really broken down into burnout and secondary trauma. You can have one without the other, but I think honestly, there should be like a connection here, because we know that burnout can make us more vulnerable. When we're stressed, we're more vulnerable to various situations or symptoms where we might experience that trauma a little differently than we would have when we weren't burned out. And then also, you know, the flip side that certainly secondary trauma, when you're exposed to it over and over, it can create this sense of burnout for you. And so now Dr. Woody's actually going to talk to you again about the model that Dr. Beth Stram created, which is this professional quality of life scale that you guys can actually use and start to look at for yourselves. Dr. Woody?
Sure, thanks, Dr. Wood. When you think about it, it makes perfect sense. I mean, you work every day with stressful circumstances, you know about it, oftentimes feel yourself overwhelmed by it. But what happens over time with chronic exposure is that you begin to lose some of the refinement and the appreciation that may be within yourself in terms of your own status. And so it becomes harder for us to kind of monitor when are we getting to the point where we could probably use some things, even though we're trying to be mindful of our status. So Dr. Wood and I looked around at a variety of different scales and inventories and whatnot that address a person's level of professional satisfaction, or maybe even the lack thereof, with the situation that they have in their professional setting. And we did find one. We found a particular scale that met a number of important criteria for utilization, in that it met these that are detailed there on the screen. This tool was actually developed by Dr. Beth Hudnall-Stam and her team. And actually, she had some workings at the Idaho State University through the development of this tool. The ProQual has the components about it and represents a very usable tool to assist you in understanding where you might be with respect to the satisfaction or the fatigue level that you're experiencing. And they are not mutually exclusive. In other words, you can have satisfaction in various quadrants of your professional experience, but also be overwhelmed perhaps and fatigued. Next slide. There are some very, Dr. Wood, the next slide. There we go. There are some attributes of this tool that are very refreshing, and I've laid them out here for you. It is easy to use. It's appropriate for individuals or groups, and it can be given online or on an individual computer. It's also very easy to score. You can do the full scoring it has greater detail with specific information, but it does take a little longer. And you can consider that method if you're utilizing it for administration or maybe for research purposes within your professional cadre. The simplified scoring actually is the one that you'd probably find yourself using most often. It's quick and it's intuitive, but it is a little less specific about, the very detailed aspects of your fatigue or your satisfaction. It is very good for training situations. And finally, it's very easy to interpret. Individual scales summarize the individual's responses on each of the constructs. Viewing the combination of the scores helps us paint a picture of ourselves and what it's telling us about how we're feeling and where we're at. And most importantly, it puts an empirical value on it so that if you were to decide that maybe this is reflecting something I need to address, you can then come back at some point later after you've tried different mitigation or mindfulness approaches and see just how much change has occurred. Next slide. Importantly, the ProQual's utility extends to the idea of becoming more resilient in responding to stress and the fatigue that can accumulate to a point of compromising our effectiveness within our work. It works on an individual, an organizational, and supervisory level, and it is a key component to the trending values within care provided both within the behavioral setting and in the medical settings, to the extent that we are an essential player in our own resiliency. And when we're using tools that enable us to assess our status, those tools become very helpful in supporting us. Next slide. Here is a reference and a hot link to Dr. Stam's ProQual tool. Now, using this tool, we as professionals can better understand how we would rate our own level of satisfaction or fatigue and what might be done to improve our situation through specific interventions. Dr. Wood is going to review now some are such a choice as we might best employ it. Dr. Wood?
Thank you. And I want to start this next section with, I think, a very powerful quote. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And I think that's really difficult for a lot of us to ascribe to. I think that we feel guilty if we feel like we're engaging in self-care or we feel like we're being selfish. And so, how do you differentiate between self-care and self-indulgence? And, if I were to ask you right now, show of hands, how many feel the same? How many feel like self-care is the same as self-indulgence? And feel free to send us a chat and say, yes, I do, or no, I don't, or just answer to yourself. And then if you answered, yes, you do feel like it's selfish, you're certainly not alone. I think, again, a lot of people find it very tough to say, sorry, I can't do that. I need to do X, Y, and Z for myself, right? And, there's that old saying that you can't truly care for somebody else unless you can care for yourself, but there's a lot of value in that. And, again, when you're as a professional dealing with students and clients and patients day in and day out, you need to find time to let yourself unwind and relax. And so really with that, when we talk about self-care, self-care is healthy. It's taking care of yourself in a way that builds resilience, it builds improved physical health and mental health. And over time, you really develop a better quality of life. And on the flip side, self-indulgence, it feels good initially. I mean, you get this kind of immediate gratification, but over time, it starts to erode and wear down your health, both again physically and emotionally, and ultimately, you're burned out, you're drained, and so self-care has many positive benefits, and I guess actually that's kind of redundant in it, so it must be really good. It's doubly good. But anyway, self-care can improve several aspects of your life, and you don't have to necessarily achieve optimal levels of each of these immediately, but with time, I think adding to that self-care and taking care of yourself day in and day out, then you're going to find that each of these areas will also increase and improve, and you'll be able to kind of find yourself heading back toward that compassion satisfaction. And maybe identify, through some of the information that you learn now or doing the pro-qual, what kinds of things can I do to build effectiveness, or how do I practice mindfulness? Those are things that we can do, and then hopefully you'll be able to find the ability to work on those, but not feel guilty about that. This next slide is, self-care is unique for each individual. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. As a professional, there may be multiple things that you can do that do benefit you and other professionals, but each of us has kind of our own quote-unquote service manual that helps us achieve our optimal quality of life. And so there are a number of elements or categories that we look at and identify areas where, in each of those, where there's self-care opportunities. And we're actually going to invite you as the group to help us sort through these. What we would like to do is take about 5 minutes and have you break out into 4 different groups. Each group is assigned a specific topic. So group 1, you'll be discussing physical care. What kinds of things do you guys do that improve your physical care, where you see that you could improve self-care related to physical aspects? Group 2, we're going to ask you to identify emotional or mental health ways to address self-care. Group 3, social ways, as well as group 4 in looking at professional ways. So each of the groups, you're going to have about 5 minutes. We are asking that you maybe quickly introduce yourselves, identify a group leader that can jot down the answers of the group and that would be willing to share them, because when we reconvene, we're going to go through lists of ideas that we have and see where we match and what other kind of opportunities maybe that we've missed, or additional ones that you guys hadn't thought of. And so you will automatically be sent to a group, and then we'll all come back together and start discussing the ideas that we found. Now, what we would like to do is invite the spokesperson identified for group 1 and see what types of things they identified as possible forms of self-care.
Hi, I hope you can all hear me. We of course touched on exercise. That's a really big one, but we found that there was other physical ways to release stress, just being in the garden and pulling the weeds, or just pushing the lawnmower, that can relieve some stress. Even sensory, just petting your fluffy dog, running your feet through that fluffy carpet that you have. Even sometimes food in a positive way, just can kind of be that physical sensory that you're looking for to relieve some stress. There were some other good ones, just taking a bath, just being in a physical space that is nice and calming for you. Those are some of the things that we talked about.
Great. It looks like you identified a number of things on our list. A couple of things that we also identified were, maintaining a healthy diet and staying well hydrated, attending to your medical, dental, mental health needs, trying to reduce alcohol, nicotine, other substance use, and that can quickly become a negative behavior. And if you do choose to drink, then try to follow recommended guidelines for each gender. Taking breaks, I think you may have mentioned getting some fresh air, going into the garden. I think that's a great idea, finding some new hobbies and ways to physically engage and disconnect as well. Also along those lines are deep breathing, other relaxation techniques, yoga, those types of things. So I think, there are a number of things, again, talking about the uniqueness for each individual. Some of these things may be appealing to you and others not, and that's completely okay. But we do encourage you to choose maybe a couple and try those. So next we'll go to the group for emotional self-care and see what they were able to come up with.
Hey everybody, it's Keith Orchard up here in Coeur d'Alene. And Carlos, good to see you. My friend Carlos, we haven't seen you in a while. All right, so our group, we had lots of different things. I mean, number one, we said you got to be aware of what you're feeling first, self-awareness. And then the self-management part comes from all sorts of things. The very first one really is like name it. Name it, say it out loud, name it to tame it. And then once you can name it, you breathe, take breaks, just stop what you're doing and use a stress ball or go to friends. Something like that, anything to help you. Once you have an emotion, then we've got all the skills, but first we have to recognize that we have it, then we can go and try and meet those needs. And it might be a physical thing or it might be a social thing. And then one of the last people said, just be happy and enjoy your students. It really helps a lot, not taking it personally and just finding enjoyment in what you're doing.
Great, thank you, Keith. Again, able to identify or at some context of much of what the group identified. Here's a list of additional ones that we suggest or look at. And so then just in the matter of time, I'm going to jump to the social needs and let Dr. Woody take this.
Okay, well, thanks, Dr. Wood. Can the person from group 3, the leader, step up?
That's me, Emma. So we talked about some ways for social self-care. We talked about laughing, different recreational activities with friends or loved ones, sharing a meal with friends, getting together with siblings, soaking in a hot tub with friends, doing some sort of form of exercise and movement, such as walking or hiking with friends. We talked about working in our garden and talking and singing with our dogs and pets. So we talked about how even that can be social if we're talking with them. Maybe going to the dog park and taking time to relax and socialize with others that have a similar interest or something in common with us. Doing some volunteer work, that was a big one. And then also just the idea of making an effort with a social life and social self-care because of the way our world has been lately, but making sure we have that balance as well.
Oh, that's awesome, Emma. Nice work. You guys came up with a lot. We had basically those tangible sorts of things that included socialized activities, but I really like the one that you brought up regarding singing, because there's some fascinating research about what that does to our neurochemistry and hormonal levels. When you sing with other folks, you get oxytocin levels going in your head, and that's a good thing for all kinds of reasons. So thank you very much, Group 3. Outstanding effort. Okay, let's go to Group 4. All right. We're talking now about professional stuff again. Would the group 4 transcriber step forward? Uh-oh, no group 4?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that we really identified a transcriber, but I'll be that person. My name is LaDonna Toonstra, and I'm talking to you here from Boise, Idaho. And we recognized our professional, like our buildings and our principals, as helpers in facilitating that by organizing things like yoga or something to help us participate. We also noticed the benefit of having an accountability partner as we set limits and perhaps turn off our devices at a certain time.
So and downstairs.
Like not answering emails from home and stuff. So yeah, we had a lot of really good ones. It was just thrilling to be in the room with so many teachers and counselors and hear how they were managing their professional boundaries.
Thank you so much, LaDonna. Nice work. It is probably very difficult at the broadest sense for us to connect with professional self-care. Partly because it requires the support of our leadership, whether it's an agency owner or whether it's a school district administrators who actually hold that in high regard. But it nonetheless is an important component of sustaining our efforts in professional work. So the contributions that you guys have made in your sharing of these ideas have gone down into components of the chat. You are more than welcome to retain components that we have here. We hope that they might be effective. I will turn it over to Dr. Wood to give some closing remarks. We know that we're a bit beyond the clock, and so we want to hustle along into the evening. So Dr. Wood, are there further thoughts that you have?
Oh, I just want to thank everybody and remind everybody that while we're all at risk, we all have the ability to share and create a more positive, supportive environment. And so I don't know if we have time for questions. I'll let Mindy or Nicole jump. And again, apologies for going over.
Thank you both so much. Such good information. You can see their emails there on the screen. If we don't get to your questions, you can email them directly. Let's quickly get to a few. Lee asked, are there some personalities that are more susceptible to the effects of stress and trauma, or is it the stress and trauma that determine the personality? Dr. Wood or Dr. Woody, any thoughts on that?
I can answer that in that, we know that there are some personality types that are more as a result of childhood trauma. I mean, when we have chronic toxic stress over and over and over, we develop survival skills. And those survival skills that we develop as a child may not carry us over into adulthood and actually can create problems. So I think, there are personality types, personality disorders such as borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder that, kind of go hand in hand with childhood trauma. And so when you look at that trauma, some of those traits will develop. And so they can be more related to stress.
Jennifer and Lee had similar second question here that Jennifer also had. Given a similar set of ACEs, why does one child respond with violence and another with withdrawal or depression? Kind of like, why do you see such different outcomes?
I think you have to take into consideration that we're all unique. And even though the stressors may be similar in their intensity, the resources that an individual might have to bring to mitigation of that stress is highly variable, particularly even within the individual as they interpret the circumstances. Over the long haul, I think the child who tends to deal best with stress is that child who had representative participation of a caregiver. You can see that time and time again in terms of those children who have chronic toxic stress issues. There's simply an absence of appropriate levels of support.
LaDonna asks, she says she read an article that attempted to connect adult personality disorders to early childhood trauma. Your thoughts?
I think that goes back to that previous question where we talked about kind of the chicken and the egg. And I do feel like the thoughts are more around that trauma, and the child develops ways to cope and reactions and reactivity to certain situations. And so I think it's more trauma based and environment. I mean, it can be environmental as well, as we grow into adults. So hopefully that answers the question a little bit more.
Well, I guess I'd like to address it from the standpoint of someone who perhaps didn't have a personality disorder, but was clinically depressed and then encountered a long series of traumatic events. That person is highly likely to less well manage the recovery from those issues. If you have an anxiety disorder and you encounter lots of trauma over a period of time, your susceptibility to significant limitations is probably higher than someone who doesn't have an anxiety problem. So.
And I would imagine that's where having at least one special person in your life you can go to that really helps promote resilience to get through that type of trauma is so important. What I kept hearing again and again, interviewing people for the documentary. Misty, real quick, she asked, does the age of a child when the trauma happens make a difference in how much they're affected? Does age come into play? What stages the trauma happened?
I think it does. I think I envision it much like the trajectory of a rocket launching from a pad. The earlier you intervene in a destructive fashion, the less likely that trajectory is going to return to its normal course without some mitigating support. So yes, early toxic stress issues really create very significant obstacles for normal development.
And it sounds like Jennifer is in education, and she does deal with kids that have a lot of trauma, try and help them with their ACEs. But it sounds like some frustration with how do you bounce back when you don't have a lot of support or understanding from your administration. You know, how do you not get that burnout or secondary trauma if you feel alone trying to meet the needs of students?
And that's right. I mean, that isolation is one of the negative or risk factors that we've identified. And so when you're alone and you feel like you don't have that support, it's hard to find time. But there are some, healthy coping skills, some resiliency, potentially recruiting other colleagues that feel the same, and try to develop some support there. It may not be the administrative support, but possibly starting with other colleagues and then moving toward that administration, offering suggestions, making them aware, helping them to understand the importance of it may ultimately make a difference.
Well, that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much to our guest panelists, Dr. Wood and Dr. Woody. A big thanks to our sponsors of tonight's event, Optum Idaho, the Idaho Children's Trust Fund, and Idaho Public Television. I also want to thank everyone for participating. We had great feedback, great conversation going. Again, if you have questions that we didn't get to, or if you'd prefer to ask the doctors directly, again, their email address is julie.a.wood@optum.com or dennis.j.woody@optum.com. And perhaps we can put that in the chat if that's not up already. And we'd like your feedback about tonight. We are now launching a poll. It will come up on your screen in a few seconds. And if you would just take a few seconds to fill that out, it would be so helpful to us. So let's just pause for a few seconds, let the poll pop up, and let you get started on that before just a few more closing notes. Okay, and we'll have 2 more of these sessions on Thursday, September 16th and Thursday, October 21st. Both of those will be in the evening. Please make sure you register for those next two events. You can do that at idahoptv.org/resilience. And some of you got to hear from Keith Orchard. He will be one of our guest speakers. He's in the documentary, and he'll be talking with lots of great knowledge from school perspective and also a past social worker. Let's see, we'll also have some Q&A time as well on that, so we hope it'll stay really interactive. And finally, in addition to the resources that are in the documentary, we want to remind everyone, if you or someone you know needs help, our state has the helpline. It's 211. Thanks again, everyone, so much for joining us. Take care.